about, do you change people's hearts and minds, or do you change the laws? How do you start? Which one do you start with? Which one is more necessary? They're both needed, but how do we? I think part of what your work shows is a real recognition that the inner lives of people are essential to engage with in human rights work. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
Sure. I mean, everything that I say and share with you today, I'm starting with the caveat that I'm in the middle of the changing nature of making change myself. So at this time, at least in my own journey, I share insights that could change tomorrow. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm in a place of quite a lot of transformation myself, and I'm really walking the path one step at a time while looking at the wisdom and the learning that I have and staying really curious about whether that's really true and what is unfolding. And I think that some of that is just coming from, as you pointed out, for a lot of us, we've walked social justice paths, we've stepped into spiritual work or looking at issues of consciousness. We're coming back to issues, we're finding intersections in different ways. And certainly everything around us is transforming so rapidly that I think we ourselves need to be standing on ground that is also able to pivot and move and shift and engage with things as they are transforming around us. Okay, so I'm just going to share a little bit about my journey to come to answering your question. You know, I started out as a very sort of, you know, strong advocate, very fuerte feminist, really in college, ended up going to law school, integrating my activism with a deeper understanding of law and policy and how that informs social change. I started an organization that worked with battered South Asian women in New York City, worked in the area of philanthropy as well, both with a human rights organization that worked on social justice issues in the United States, then with the Ford Foundation in India as the human rights program officer, also became a part of the global human rights movement, calling for the recognition of women's rights as human rights, when I was at the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers, you know, and then became deeply involved in immigrant rights, racial justice, and a whole bunch of other issues from a deeply intersectional perspective of how all of the ways in which power and privilege actually play themselves out in our lives, in our society, and how everything that we live and breathe is currently constructed. So I moved into a culture change orientation because having really tried to move the needle from a law and policy point of view, as well as from working with individuals, you know, who had experienced violence, what I began to feel was that when we worked with individuals who had experienced violence, we were dealing with the problem after the fact. We were dealing with the situation after the violation had already transpired. And when we were looking at law and policy, we were again, you know, trying to create structures that we had a really difficult time implementing because we thought that just by law alone, we could achieve outcomes. And we were still working within patriarchal norms. We were still working within patriarchal structures to kind of shift all of those things. The other thing that I realized was that many of us in the social justice space really talked to just one another. We didn't really engage a broader constituency in any of the conversations that we were having. And so, you know, even though I'd been working in the space for 20 years, my parents still didn't understand a damn thing about what I was doing. We were really looking to change the milieu around us. What is it that we were missing? And what is it that we needed to do to really engage a much larger shifting of power and privilege, really? So the idea of culture change for me really came from that experience and looking at how one might use media, arts, technology, different forms of engagement to start shifting narratives, to start actually shifting the story that we all told ourselves. And so in a way, that's how my work that I currently do in terms of leading this organization called Breakthrough really began. And I began with creating a music video and a music album in India that told the story of this battered woman who became a truck driver. And, you know, it was one of those crazy storylines that was actually inspired by a true story. And despite all the naysayers, both in the women's movement as well as in the entertainment industry, who just thought I was completely crazy, the album ended up becoming this big hit, top 10, you know, shifting the conversation in a way that I was curious about, and it actually started to happen. So then I embarked on creating Breakthrough. I left the Ford Foundation and sort of really exploring this question of how do we transform the cultures within which we live? How do we engage hearts and minds? And not just how do we engage hearts and minds, how do we then also shift our actions? I mean, since all of us are engaged in exploration of consciousness, this question of what is the alignment between our words, our thoughts, and our actions, I think is something that we're all constantly asking. So really, in a way, culture change for me was about how do you transform hearts? How do you transform minds? And how do you then get to actions that are shifting the way in which we treat one another, with the primary arena that I was exploring being the issue of gender-based violence, multiple forms of violence against women, you know, against, which encompassed pretty much the entire planet. Yeah. So that's a little bit of sort of where my thinking was and has been around this question of culture change as a way to think about social change.
Do you want to?
Yeah. If I understand you right, the basic insight you're working with, and I really find this very important for any kind of social activism. It's not just about power and power structures. It is about hearts and minds, because the way one relates to power and the way one relates to hearts and minds is completely different. Basically, there's a different approach, and you brought in and you said your parents still don't understand really what you're doing. In reaching out to people who are embedded in cultures, as we all are, is a different way of communicating. It's not addressing power as being an oppressed and talking to the power as the oppressed. It's talking from a human being to a human being and trying to find a mutual understanding how culture can be different and how we can meet on a human basis. And that, as I understand, is a different foundation how we engage with social activism. And I would like to understand, is this this basic insight that you're working with, and how does this change the implication to work for gender rights in India or worldwide? How does this change if you talk it from this direction and not from the usual power structure motive social activism approach?
So that's a great question. And, you know, this question of power, I think, is actually very multifaceted. There's this whole question, I think, really facing our planet right now is how do we do power differently? How do we do power differently as individuals in our own locations where we might have power? So, you know, how we show up as individuals, how we show up in our families, how we show up in our workplaces, how we show up in our communities, our schools, our colleges, our governments. It's very different from having an engagement with an oppositional way to a power structure that one sees as external, as opposed to a conversation about really understanding that we're all part of that ecosystem, right? That these systems don't get created just in and of themselves. We populate them. So there is no us and them. It is really all of us. And so when you shift the conversation to the way in which you just described it, an engagement that is around how do we do power differently in all of these different ways, including ourselves, vis-a-vis ourselves within ourselves, and then I think we're able to perhaps find a pathway to a different conversation. Now, let me give you an example, right? You know, for a very long time, our engagement with men around the issue of, say, domestic violence or rape or sexual assault really was in this place of perpetrator-victim, right? Like that's the dynamic that we're dealing with. And certainly, because of the kind of privilege that men have in our society, there is a huge amount of violence against women that happens at the hands of men. At the same time, we can't really shift that unless men are a part of the engagement process of shifting it. It can't just be a conversation like this. It has to be a conversation that engages us together. So an example of how we experimented with it was we tried to create this campaign called Ring the Bell, a bell bajao. And so we worked with Ogilvy to create a narrative arc where you're hearing domestic violence down the corridor, you're reading your paper, you're a guy. What do? Do you continue reading the paper? Do you ignore what's happening? And so in the campaign that we created, the neighbor gets up, goes to the neighbor that the noise is coming from, rings the doorbell, and interrupts the violence with, say, do you have any milk? Can I borrow some sugar? My dog ran out of my apartment. Is he in your apartment? You know, depending on the context. And in that exchange, the man is making clear to the other man that he is disapproving of the violence. Like there's an interruption happening.
And he's seen. And he's the man who's been perpetrating the violence has been seen by another man. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So there's a peer shift that's happening around how we're asking men to engage in this conversation that's different from the previous arc of you are the violator alone, right? Like this is a shift into how do you become a part of the solution? How do you show up and be accountable for this, right? And it was amazing what response it created in terms of really having men coming out of the woodwork and saying, you know, it's the first time we've been invited to be a part of the conversation. Similarly, in our work in the United States around sexual violence on college campuses and issues of consent, I mean, this is a huge, huge issue right now.
If I just may jump in on your TV campaign Ring the Bell, because we saw these clips, and I have been very impressed also watching them as a man, because I was just impressed how I was addressed as a man, because there's something going on, particularly in the man who is seeing the violation. You saw his insecurity, how to respond. And you saw this eye contact from man to man, and then basically it's just this kind of innocent sense like, do you have milk or something like that? Nothing more is to be said. But the way you are part of the scene is not just as a perpetrator, but also someone who is a human being and he's seeing this and responding to that, which allows me as a man to kind of perceive what is portrayed in a very different way than just being accused of being a violent man. And I just see how this allows a different conversation to start. When men see this, they are not addressed as the people who are just violent. They're also the people who have a heart to respond. It's a heart-to-heart conversation.
That's right.
And this is, if I may say so, consciousness-based or heart-based, without neglecting the reality of the brutal house violence that's going on worldwide, and also particularly in India. It's not making anything nicer than it is, but the talking point is a very different one that you were choosing.
Yeah, that's right.
What I find and everyone who's listening, you should check out it. We saw the clips in your TED Talk, which we've circulated quite a bit. The Ring the Bell campaign, two of the commercials from the campaign. But what's interesting is that when one addresses a cultural system or a shared set of assumptions that people are living from, you can't step outside of that to address it. It has to be addressed by all the participants in the dynamic. And for years, when the feminist movement has addressed, as you were saying, domestic violence or rape or whatever, men have had two roles. You can be a bystander, which is pretty horrible, or a perpetrator. And to create a very human space of creative response that isn't, I have to go and beat up that guy, but is a different option of response that is simply you're seen in this as a man who is perpetrating violence. It creates something in the whole system that then can change.
Well, so this is the question. I don't know. I mean, we're still dealing with oodles of violence against women, and certainly as more and more resistance to patriarchal norms throws itself up across the planet, the backlash is also pretty intense. And so we're watching, I think, patriarchal systems being rattled and collapsing, and the tail of that is also then manifesting itself in, the many ways in which violence is just erupting in multiple ways. So I think that, when we say are working with men in fraternities in the United States, it's a similar set of questions, because we're all part of the same cultural soup that created these things. We're all, we're all complicit in these situations. Now, we've had guys in the States now grow up with a sense of entitlement, with a sense of, you go to college and you score, a fraternity culture that values masculinity by how many women you can have sex with, or how many pictures of breasts you can take, or whatever the initiation rights are around your being an insider to a particular group, that rests on the domination and the treatment of another group of people in a certain kind of way. And then women come to college campuses also very much about finally having freedom, exploring sexuality. All of the narrative means that have come through this is that, you're cool if you're at fraternity parties,
right?
You got to be with the in guys, all of this, right?
And you also don't want to be, you want to show that you're cool and you can handle stuff and you can take the jokes about women. It's like it's like not a problem.
Right. Now, what's happening in the middle of this cultural set of norms that we've lived all of these years. I remember when I went to Mount Holyoke, the Dartmouth frats used to come for parties, and there would be one group of women that would lock their doors because we knew that there were going to be rapes on campus that weekend, and there would be another group of women that would be partying with the guys, right? And so it's 28 years later, and the norm around that is getting disrupted. The disruption that's happening is that women are saying, you know what, not okay. All of the mechanisms and everything that we learn as kids going into college hasn't shifted. But now at that point in college, there's a shift that's happening after all of these years of the women's movement and everything else that's challenging what the norm has been around masculine culture on college campuses. And so that disruption is also creating enormous amounts of angst. What is consent? How do you say yes? When do you say no? What is rape? What is rape culture? And so all of a sudden, parents are saying, oh, we're really worried about the safety of our girls, or saying we're really worried about our boys getting accused of something. But the same culture has been in existence all of these years. It's suddenly that there's a different conversation going on about it, right? So for us as Breakthrough and from a culture change approach, it's really important for us to be working with the men and the women. It's really important for us to be engaging with fraternities and having a conversation about what is masculinity? How do you show up in terms of all these values that you talk about, in terms of honor and brotherhood and fraternity? Like, what does that actually mean, and how do you show up, and how do you take accountability for it? So, you know, in the first year of college, the first week of college, there are often these big signs on fraternity houses that are really disrespectful to women, and that say things like, dads, drop your daughters off here. We know what to do with them. You know, like really offensive rape culture stuff. So some of the men that we've been working with have started creating banners for that first week that totally counter that kind of action. So again, what's the space that's getting created for men to engage with one another and start challenging these norms to create a new set of norms? Creating a new set of norms also means having accountability. It also means having laws and policies in place that are implemented. It also means shifting sort of pop culture memes around what's cool, what's not cool, right? So that's why culture change makes you think about the ecosystem. Who are all of the players that need to move and shift and change? And I think that that's the difference between a more traditional rights-based approach that simply articulates it as a penalty, accountability, change structure, right? Like the ecosystem approach, the culture change approach recognizes how all of us need to be a part of the transformation, while still having accountability be an integral part of that story.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that I think that it's a much more complex approach, because when you say, oh, we're going to pass policies and we're going to apply, you know, punishments in these ways, it didn't quite work really. But it's a much more systemic and complex approach that doesn't create these easy oppositions. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing and looking at how people are thinking about activism these days is an attempt to or is the realization that when one comes back at, let's say, a situation in which violence is being perpetrated when there's this movement against, I mean, we have to have standards. We all have to have, you know, ways that we're saying, no, this is how we're going to live together, and these things are not okay. But that the kind of movements against that create that create a new kind of dominance. Maybe the dominance of of those who were. It's not exactly that, because it doesn't work this way. But when you're a dominance of the people who've been oppressed, when you're trying to say, okay, now this is the superior thing. That when you're acting against, you're not fundamentally changing the dynamic in the culture.
And I think that this question of, you know, for those of us who are engaged in work around consciousness, is there a post-oppositional way of doing something, right?
Exactly.
You know, is there a way in which we hold everything with love and compassion? And does that shift then how we show up, and the quality of the way in which we then try to shift the thing that it is that we are trying to shift? or is the very nature of trying to shift something oppositional at its core. And so therefore, you know, I mean, and I think that for me, having walked into the space of consciousness and spirituality more recently than probably you guys have, I mean, I think for me, it's been more of a journey in the last 5 or 6 years. This is really where I am asking a lot of questions. How does one hold space from that place of love and compassion and interdependence as the value frame, while also being committed to a different way of how we live together on this planet, of understanding that our current ways are not in service of ourselves or any of the other beings that we inhabit this planet with, or Earth itself, right? So we understand that from our place of consciousness. So we shift our consciousness around that. What then happens to our actions? What is it that we should be doing differently from that place? And that's my big conundrum right now. So even as I have tried to explore that with this culture change work, I still have a lot of questions about how much of that still reproduces the same power and privilege places that one is trying to dismantle. And quite honestly, I don't know.
Yeah. If you don't mind, and I appreciate that as you're saying, it's a conundrum for yourself, but I would really like to ask you about your understanding. How would it look like a post-oppositional form of engagement, particularly in your field of engagement, gender violence? Things could be very simple, and the oppositional paradigms are very simple. How could a different way how to go about this look like? And I mean, I'm sure there are no easy answers, but just thinking about this, is there some way how this could open up?
So, you know, one of the questions that I'm asking myself is, what is the difference between a human rights paradigm and an interconnectedness paradigm?
Okay.
And so if you approach this question from a human rights paradigm, which is really the paradigm that I have sat in for the last 3 decades, then you often find yourself in sort of the triangle of victim, oppressor, and remedy, right? So you're de facto then engaging with everything that you're trying to shift by locating people somewhere in that triangle. And that triangle then just becomes, you know, at any given point, we could be at different points in that. It isn't as if anything is just structured in just one way, but you kind of keep reproducing that same thing, right? If you move out of that and start thinking about it from an interconnectedness paradigm, and you think about how we are beginning to really see and experience, you know, the relationship between the flap of a butterfly's wings and a tsunami, and then everything in between. And then we ask the question, what gets in the way of interconnectedness? And approach what is getting in the way from standing in a place of interconnectedness, then perhaps the quality of how one engages in that question shifts. And that's something that I'm actually experimenting with right now. I can't give you a definitive answer. It's something that has started to really shift in my own work. It's not even necessarily something that's not started to shift in Breakthrough's work overall. It's a place that I'm walking. So if I talk about the world that we want to live in from a place where interconnectedness is the frame, and how do we get to a place of you know, where, how do all beings live with ease and live with happiness and live with freedom, you know, the most sort of the basic Sanskrit, Lokesh samasta sukhino bhavantu. If that's the place in which I stand, then maybe everything I do has to change. And I haven't found too many spaces where the consciousness, spirituality work and the social justice work have come to intersect where I see complete clarity. I think all of us are asking these questions, as is this whole enterprise that you're a part of.
Yeah.
So you can't take away, you can't sit in a place of interconnectedness and then ignore all of the ways in which power and privilege do manifest themselves.
No.
You know, which is what a lot of the spiritual world has done. Like you kind of go off and you meditate and everybody sits and says Om and expects everything to change. And then the other side is, you know, you've constantly got sword up, you're constantly warrior mode. And so then you're just constantly in an oppositional framework. So somewhere between these spaces, or maybe somewhere beyond these spaces, lies something else, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We often speak about prior unity, that there is a prior unity of life. There's a prior unity to life, but that out of that prior unity comes the extraordinary diversity that we are, and that diversity itself then creates a different kind of unity. But if we're coming from a groundedness in unity, not as a bypass, because I think that's what you're talking about, you know, where you say, okay, we're all one, and, you know, or I simply need to meditate and my consciousness will radiate and everything will become better, or this is all an illusion, which I think is often what the transcendental, you know, religions point to. This is samsara, this is illusion, this is not real. It's real. It's very real. But if we come from this, I think this is what we're experimenting with and have done in our work. If we come from this place of prior unity and then look at all that needs to change and are working and use that capacity for of integration that prior unity brings to be able to bring people together to engage in these questions, because I think that these kinds of models suggest collective ways of responding also, rather than here's a program that's going to be delivered, and that the delivery of that program is going to, you know, impart what is needed. It becomes and this is part of what we hope that we're doing, that engaging in the conversation is part of the intervention, because holding this space of prior unity and exploring these difficult questions that together, even on the ground, creates a potential for new things that can emerge that are not that we can't foresee. Because whatever it is that needs, that however it is that we're going to move to a non-oppositional culture, it's not simply going. It's not going to be something that we already know. Otherwise, we would have done it already.
Well, I mean, I think that there's 100 questions, right, around all of that. I mean, and these are some of the questions that I have. These are some of the conversations that I have with other people who are in the social justice world, who are walking a similar path. And I think that one of the experiences around all of this is that a very large number of the people who are in the spaces where these conversations are happening are, and I'm just going to put it out there, Caucasian, privileged, Western, right? And so a lot of the containers are being created with those parameters. The voices of indigenous peoples or, you know, wisdom keepers from ancient traditions and others who've actually held these containers for a long, long while still don't have the same place and location and get brought in some of these ways. And so what ends up happening, and I see this a lot, is that the ability of multiple people in multiple positionalities to then walk into these conversations without getting triggered.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
All of the stuff that, you know, everyone's already carrying is limited.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I watch, I'm a part of it, like sort of seeing how everything that you just laid out gets conversed around, but then how people even show up in the conversation, you kind of fall down the rabbit hole again and again. And so this is something that I'm just trying to figure out. How do we do this while understanding that all of us are coming from our places of location and trauma and positionality that then, you know, carries its own baggage with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're faced with that immediately.
Yeah. Mm. I mean, and so am I. I mean, all of us in our multiple locations, you know, there's a way in which also then when I'm not, it's because dimensions of myself, because I happen to be female and Indian in this incarnation, carry with it another sort of positioning or another set of assumptions, right? Which aren't necessarily really supporting this idea of a prior unity and you know, everything else either. So to come back to some of the stuff that I was trying to talk about earlier in the context of culture change, you know, the importance of storytelling and the importance of narrative and the importance of myth making. And I don't mean myth making in terms of lies, myths as lies, but the creation of myths that are, you know, the narrative arcs within which we then create our maps and our destinies has been really important to me. And so even the ads that you're talking about, there's a lot that I think about in terms of what's the story? How is the story being told? What is the mechanism of the story? Who is telling the story? Who's engaged in the co-creation of that story or receiving that story, right? So a lot of my work in the last couple of years, last decade and a half, has been around, you know, music videos, video games, short video stories, PSAs, comedy, spoken word, different forms of storytelling expression. Because I think that there's also ways in which we have to find paths for people to walk. You know, it's like, how do you land there from here, right?
Isn't it very connected to what you said before about this paradigm shift that you were describing from human rights to interrelatedness? Because the storytelling or the myth, in the positive sense of myth that you're describing, that is a form of our interrelatedness. The stories that we are telling to us, in which form, one-on-one or in mass media, this is a form of our interrelatedness as we are telling it to ourselves. So that's basically changing this story in a story that liberates us from oppression, let's put it that way, is not talking about human rights in that way. Human rights are part of the story. But basically, how can we tell a story to us that is appropriate to all of us? That's a very consciousness-oriented question and a very cultural one. Because we tell all kinds of stories, and they're very opposing, and they're very oppressive, and they're very racist and whatever. So finding a way to tell stories that and you can put it directly on a global scale, that we find global stories for each other in our multiplicity of different nations, different gender, different cultures, that we have a sustainable story for us, or sustainable stories, is a very different way of understanding what activism could be about. That's how I understand your focus to read what is the right story to tell here.
Well, I will say this, that I'm in a deep personal crisis around the paradigm of human rights, you know, and I run an organization whose tagline says, human rights start with you. So I think storytelling as a way of communication can advance anything. It can advance the reification of hierarchy and power and privilege.
Sure.
It can advance an agenda that justifies genocide.
Right.
You know, it can advance the caste system. It can advance the justification for why it's okay for men to abuse women with impunity, right? So stories can be deployed to do anything, right? To advance anything. And certainly so much of what we see and deep knowledge in the advertising industry of how to tell stories to make consumption culture the thing, you know, around the specific thing that they might be trying to get you to purchase. But the creation of consumption culture is deeply invested in storytelling to create certain kinds of behaviors. And so that's one of the reasons why, for me, this question of stories is so important, because culture change requires us to be telling different stories. And yes, the nature of storytelling itself, Thomas, is exactly as you said. It is the story of interconnectedness and interdependence. But there's a piece of that, I think, that we still have to excavate and figure out, right?
Well, excavate, I think seems really important, because there are the stories that cultures tell that are overt stories, but then there are stories that people are actually living by. And those are often quite different. You won't find, you don't find the stories of the kind of oppression that you're talking about as usually as the overt story of a people or a culture, but it is the story that people are living. And for those stories to be brought forward or kind of lifted up to be seen, and a different narrative created from them or different options created from them, seems to be part of what you're speaking about.
Well, and I also think that what's happened with technology and social media and the ways in which we can tell stories today is a game changer. I mean, the whole question of consciousness and where we're going, I think we really are at a moment where everything is possible in a way that it wasn't before. And so again, what is that intersection? What is that opportunity for that shift that we are all trying to hold space for with the means that we have, both ancient technologies and modern technologies, right? Like how does that come together to help us move some of this forward?
Yeah. Great. I think what I'd like to do now, because I'm sure our audience is getting a little restless, is, if you don't mind, open up the cameras and the lines for questions.
You should be unmuted now.
Oh, you can hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. What I was saying was that this is such a fascinating conversation, and I had not heard the phrase post-oppositional activism. I want to put that in big fat letters and wear it on my forehead. And I'm in thinking about stories. It seems to me that stories have, first of all, I'm very leery of the idea that there will be one story. I have a feeling there may be many. And it seems to me that when we're talking about stories, we can think about them in two ways. And one of them is the power to generate change, to actually start something. But the other part of it is how stories reinforce. And I think back to the time when we had, Elizabeth will be familiar with this, when we had consciousness raising conversations. And it wasn't just one conversation, it was many over a period of time that changed my life and the lives of a lot of women. It seems to me that stories are part of the change. and we can kind of get on the wheel at almost any point to create the story or to retell an old story or to add a different story that hasn't been told before and reinforce what's new. All of that is incredibly challenging. And it seems to me the level of consciousness that we bring to it is what will be reflected in the stories. So the internal work is extremely important as well. That's just sort of where I am with all of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margaret.
Mallika, do you want to respond to that, or?
No, I think she's absolutely right. I mean, yeah.
Okay. Tony? Tony at the top, he has his hand up.
Tony, you're unmuted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you can.
Well, one of the problems when I was logging in, my apologies for what happened.
That's
But
okay.
I had deliberately muted myself. And I didn't think somebody in unmuting may turn me on again.
I see.
I'm sorry about that, but a bit confused because there were a few points just 2 points I would like to draw your attention to.
Yes, please.
I don't know. There's somebody on screen in front of me. She's not speaking, but she's smoking. I don't know why she's there. Hi. 2 words, story and power. I do a lot of work with Pachamama Alliance, and I would differentiate between story and dream. Because quite often what people are calling their own story is inherited. And what they're doing is they're living in a dream. Now, that's one point, and we can elaborate on it if necessary, if you aren't familiar with the difference in the two that I'm making. But the second point is power. I've done a lot of work over my lifetime with group dynamics, and I like to differentiate between power and authority. Now, power is the right to do something. Sorry, power is the ability to do something. Like I can, from my end here, I have the power to turn my voice, to mute it or to turn it on, to change my camera. But the group leader has the authority to shut me up if I'm getting in the way. So I think when we're using the word power, we quite often are referring to authority when we're talking about confronting it or the way it intimidates us. And those two together link, because if people don't feel that they have the authority over their own lives, then they will be subjugated by the dreams of another person, by the dreams of another society. So I just want to make those two differences. Mm-hmm. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll mute myself now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, this whole question of power and privilege and authority and how all of this plays out, is one of those conversations that is so vast because power manifests in multiple ways. I mean, there's power over something, there's power to do something, there's power with someone. There's some feminist scholars who talk about the concept of power under, also being kind of a whole way of thinking about power. And at the end of the day, I at least in how I'm grappling with some of these questions myself, at least how I understand it is that we currently live in a predominant system where power over is the determinative model, right? So power over the earth, power over women, power over certain ethnicities, minorities, constituencies in different ways. And by power over, I mean we live in a system where there's enormous hierarchy, and that is reinforced by a culture of fear and scarcity, right? So if you create enough fear and everything is scarce, then you have to have power over various elements of all of this, because that's the only way in which you can sustain yourself and live on this planet, right? So how does one take the idea of power and do it differently is the question of an intensive that I co-teach with Sharon Salzberg, who's this amazing meditation teacher, Leslie Salmon Jones, who is this incredible movement yoga teacher, Carla Goldstein, who's at Omega. So we created this intensive 4 years ago, which is for women. It's a week-long intensive, and really the question that we ask ourselves constantly in how we engage with the participants is, how do we do power differently? And all of the challenges to that, because we are all part of the cultural contexts that have created us. And so in that conversation, certainly the distinction between power and authority are very, very important. So thank you so much for raising that. And, the question of stories and then how that happens and who tells those stories certainly are really important as part of that question of how do we do power differently. So I'm not really trying to answer anything that anyone has raised. I'm really using your very excellent points as points of departure to just unpack some of this stuff even more. The idea of dreaming, I mean, part of the challenge, I think, when we do have these conversations is that so many of us are using words differently. We're attributing different meanings. We're using the same word, but we're attributing different meanings to those words. And so how then does that influence the conversation that we're having? Are we actually having a conversation? Are we like talking like this? Where is all of this, that? I want to share one experience around this whole question of doing power differently and teaching intersectionality, power, and privilege as one of the things that I do at this Omega Intensive that I teach, that's going to be coming up in a couple of weeks. When I taught the intensive from the place of human rights, when I taught intersectionality and power and privilege from a place of human rights, I often found myself creating a container that had people sort of devolve. And people devolved into places of real pain and trauma, because in that group, people had to really confront the ways in which power and privilege showed up. Like, just because you were a group of 30 women together didn't mean that we were all the same. There were enormous issues of power and privilege that existed amongst the 30 of us that were predicated on sexual orientation, race, class, religion, ability, I mean, all kinds of things. And so when we opened the container that way, it would just get into a place where there was so much pain and so much trauma. And those people that saw themselves as having power and privilege would become defensive. Those people that saw themselves as not having power or privilege would start feeling more victimized. And, the whole conversation was a really hard one to hold. Ever since I've shifted to having interconnectedness be the container within which we step into the conversation of power and privilege, I've seen a shift in then what we're able to do and how we're able to have that conversation. And it doesn't mean that we don't walk the difficult path of talking about power and privilege, because we have to. In order to do power differently, we can't make invisible, the things that we are doing to one another. But then the place that we stand to have that conversation influences the nature of that conversation.
Right.
And so that's something that I'm getting more and more curious about in my own work, is if I'm holding space, where am I standing in order to facilitate that dialogue differently that could lead to us doing power differently?
I think that's really powerful what you're saying, because it's a very subtle, but it's also very powerful to use it in a very different way. a very powerful difference between standing in one place versus standing in another. And from within that perspective of rights, one wouldn't think that it would make the difference that it does, but it makes a profound difference. Now, you can't say, therefore, these things will happen or must happen or whatever from that place. You can only hold the space for a kind of co-creation.
Yep.
And that may be where we need to be. And I think, speaking of co-creation, I know a couple people had their hands up, but I think we'd like to move to breakout groups so that you can speak with each other more about these issues and have a more everyone be able to engage more. So we're gonna move into breakout groups now, and then we'll come back together. And if you still have questions, we can take them then.
You say more about the breakout groups.
So in the breakout groups, continue this discussion. It's that simple, and you'll go for about 25 minutes. I guess the one question I have for you, or one question I'd really like to know: how did you move from human rights to interconnectedness? Because as you said, and I'm aware of this, that your kind of spiritual journey, or a certain part, a claimed spiritual journey, I think seemed to open up for you in the last 5 or 6 years. How did that come about?
A divorce.
Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this question around human rights has been plaguing me for a while, and in a way, the way in which I structured Breakthrough and pushed for culture change, as the way in which we did our work, challenged and changed the human rights paradigm in terms of how we use it at Breakthrough, for sure. I mean, even the whole idea that human rights start with you, as opposed to human rights are about treaties and conventions and things that states are obligated to do. I mean, just that in and of itself, the idea of really positioning human dignity back at the core of sort of this whole enterprise. I think I'm just in a place now where, first of all, humans are not paramount anymore. And so saying human rights as the framework from where I orient privileges the human species in a way that I'm just not willing to do anymore, or it doesn't feel true to me. And so, and interconnectedness is, I'm curious about it. I haven't landed yet. I'm transitioning out of Breakthrough by the end of this year. So right now I'm really just holding space for the organization, where I have a transition team, and just going through that journey of trying to hold space for that separation to happen, with enough sort of grace and being awake through the process, as opposed to other founder transitions that just can create enormous amounts of chaos in an organization. So I really am in a very deep place of not knowing right now. I leave Breakthrough by the end of this year, and then come January, I have no idea what I'm doing. So I'm really just allowing myself to sit in that space of not knowing, and not get into my usual, Aries orientation of, okay, what's next? And in a way, I mean, I began a meditation practice only in March this year. I studied with a Zazen teacher, but in the last 6 years, I've become very deeply involved in shamanic traditions, and I trained as an energy medicine healer last year in Chile. So that is something that I've started to do, is work with individuals in the space of energy medicine.
How has your worldview shifted, do you think, or how is it shifting? What's your sense?
Well, I think much, much more understanding of the relationship between inner and outer worlds, and how important it is for us to be engaged in the internal work. Much deeper understanding of how much pain and trauma are sort of embedded in us in ways that really get in the way of the dreams that we articulate, that, you know, and this is where I sort of why I started out earlier about what's the alignment between words, thoughts, and actions. And how, you know, you can be talking about dignity and you have so much self-hatred that the gap between how you feel and what you say then plays itself out in what you do, because you can be saying one thing and then treating everybody around you like shit because you feel like shit, right? I mean, it's just becoming much more aware of how the inner world is part of the ecosystem. I mean, like when we talk about the individual, it isn't just the individual in location to the external stuff, but everything that you've carried with you to this point. So that's been a big, big shift. And certainly the understanding of interdependence as being beyond human interdependence and interconnectedness as really being about everything and everybody that not only inhabits this planet, this earth, but really everything, really, you know, the cosmos, if you will. I mean, that's been a big shift for me.
It's a huge shift.
Yeah.
Do you? I mean, I think the implication of what you're saying is that for someone who is a change maker, that the disconnections within are going to manifest in the change that one is making.
Well, and they do. And the thing is that, you know, as human beings, I think we all also understand that it's always going to be a journey. There's no sort of arrived destination. It's not as if I've now come to some space of evolved consciousness where I can just sort of sit. And I think that's where I challenge some of the, in my mind, more masculine ways of understanding spirituality, you know, which is...
I mean, goal-oriented.
Goal-oriented, or, you know, separate from and separation from being the place that you have to sit. I mean, I think there's a difference between separation and non-attachment. And I think, you know, there's a lot of confusion about those two things. So how do you stay in a place of deep engagement with the work?
Yeah. I think a lot of Buddhist meditation has being translated from basically a medieval context and medieval selves into a contemporary context that with modern minds and so forth. It doesn't work. It creates a kind of dissociation often, or the way that we practice Buddhist meditation in different forms of Buddhist meditation, I think often creates a kind of deep dissociation. Witness state is often used to disconnect rather than to embrace the truth that consciousness is awake always, you know.
And as important these forms of spirituality are, and I'm convinced they are, it's very interesting, and you seem to kind of go in the same direction, that many activists engage more in indigenous, shamanic, energetic healing forms of spirituality. And I guess because it is so earth-oriented and interconnected-oriented, there's something about meditation and transcendence and the absolute, which I think is valid and important. But there's something which is coming together right now on different levels, and it seems that you are doing something in the same direction. But this very old forms of spirituality, maybe the first forms of spirituality, and modern forms of social engagements seem to look for a new form of unity in coming together, which I find very fascinating.
That's right. I mean, and I think it also has to do with ideas of the masculine and the feminine finding complementarity and then unity, you know, and oneness. I mean, it's really interesting also for me because as a feminist from India, I have been like Hinduism, stay as far away from me as you possibly can. I mean, you know, deeply hierarchical, exploitative, horrendous religion. And then I arrive in the United States and everybody's sort of sitting around chanting, yoga and, you know, things like we're the spiritual mecca of the planet. And so, and then sort of being very judgmental of that, and then going through the journey that I have where my engagement with the shamanic world has allowed me to re-engage with Hinduism from a very place. And so
that's beautiful.
Yeah. So, you know, bring those parts of myself back into what's emerging without, again, being attached to any of it, you know, whether, I mean, I'm deeply comfortable in all the different spiritual traditions now. At the same time as also having the ability to be critical of stuff that just doesn't make sense to me. I spent some time in Brazil last year and studied candomblé as well. So it's been really a wonderful journey of exploration. And then, like I said, opening up the Hinduism, re-engaging with my own religious tradition from a very, very different place, and being able to work with those energies of Shiva and Shakti and like this incredible constellation of gods and goddesses that we have that really helped me in my energy healing practice, or even when I'm facilitating something or when I'm understanding a situation and, you know, what to kind of do with it. So it comes back to the story of archetypes and stories, narratives, and myths, right?
And it comes back to how deeply rooted that they are in us, because I know, I mean, for many of us who are Christian, you know, there's, as you're saying, there's the rejection of Christianity and the spiritual Mecca is Hinduism or Buddhism or whatever, anything that's just not Christian. But there is something about the narrative that one has grown up within, that is also, there's something important to heal in that also, I think. Absolutely. And if we're just rejecting, there's something very core that, and if you appreciate that each of these contexts, each of these sacred contexts has a pure teaching, if you will, if you want to use that word, or has an insight into consciousness, into humanity, into who we are and what we're doing here, that and to be able to uplift that or lift that out of one, or kind of re-engage with that, it creates a different kind of wholeness, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And that's, again, you know, all of these questions that we're asking around where processes and structures and systems come into play with what perhaps might be at the core. How to find our way back to that, or maybe move forward into something else. I mean, there's also this dance between, does one draw, what does one draw from the ancient, and what does one draw from the contemporary to create an alchemy of something else entirely? That's much that we have right now, is alchemy of something completely new, which is why the not knowing is so important, because
absolutely
we couldn't create anything new, right? I mean, it's that and so I also am very resistant to consciousness statements that are about knowing. You know? There's a knowing, there's that knowing, there's knowing. And I think it's very easy in the social justice world to get caught in the knowing, because this is the path to justice, this is the right way, and the same thing happens. I see the same thing happening even in the world of spirituality. Is that that sense of knowing? So that's been the other shift, I think. Really becoming much more comfortable to be able to speak about all of this. I mean, first of all, even for me to be having this conversation with all of you who've been engaged in these discussions for a long time, it's taken me a while to feel confident enough to even have a conversation, right? I don't know what the hell I'm talking about most of the time. It's just what I'm feeling into, right?
It's interesting. I think in some ways one always is just feeling into it, because there is the not there yet is the there, if you know what I mean.
And that's part of the spiritual dimension of it, because I mean, that's particular true for our Western mind, but I think it's also to some degree true for the Indian mind, that this knowing aspect has a very cognitive side to it. And there's something in a spiritual opening where there's a dimension of knowing that does not have this cognitive certainty, where you feel it has more to do with resonance with something than with kind of cognitive structures. And to be able to relate to that, I would say there is also a capacity to hold the complexity of the global world in this, that the cognitive mind never will be able to. So this is, I think, a very modern argument for a very ancient capacity. That maybe our global world in all its social diversities is so complex that we need to find ways of holding this intuition in a new way. Hi, Savannah.
Medicine space. That's why I like the energy medicine space, because it's not about words. It's really, it's about exactly that. It's about resonance. And that really speaks to me because, you know, I trained as a lawyer, as an advocate, as I can go blah, 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 blah. And, shut up. Just show up, right?
Great. Great. I think we're in a minute, we're going to bring everybody back. You're welcome to stay for the last 15 minutes to wrap up, or if we've now used a lot of your time, more than I had expected. So
I'm just going to do a quick check on my next. I think I might need to sign off.
Okay.
Fine.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you so much for your time.
So
I'd love to hear the outcome of this. But
yeah. I can send you the video if you like.
that would be
audio.
great.
Okay.
Love to hear sort of what, you know, and any feedback people have
Great.
On stuff. But thank you so much for inviting me. This has been an incredibly helpful conversation for me too.
Awesome.
To be
Great. Okay. I think we've got everybody back who's coming back. Mallika had to leave. She had another appointment pending. And right now for the last 10, 15 minutes, it's an open forum. Please keep your mic muted when you're not speaking. And if you'd like to share something from your group or from the conversation in general, please do. And you don't have to raise your hand, Savannah. If you'd like to speak, just you can unmute yourself.
And you unmute yourself by pushing the mute button on the lower left corner of your screen.
You can't do it?
You can do it. I can do it for you.
Okay.
Savannah, you are muted.
Okay. I always mute myself too. So, one thing in our group I raised is if our email addresses could be shared. I would appreciate it because I'd like to contact Mallika. I do very similar work. I tried to write to you, Elizabeth. I know you must be inundated, and I didn't get a response. I didn't know if I wrote to the right email address by any chance. And I'd like to discuss what Mallika said. I have a part of an answer to what she raised in a half-hour presentation and a 3-hour workshop. I'd like to discuss it with you or invite everybody to a free dialogue on this. And if you could, is the email that you have at Book Emerge where to contact you, Elizabeth?
Book Emerge?
Yeah, it's where you send the emails telling us about the dialogues.
Yeah, it should be if you there should be a response to the email that you got, the email about today. If you just reply to that, I should get it.
Oh, okay, great.
Okay.
And if we could get Mallika's address, I'd really like to connect with her.
I think you can you can contact her through Breakthrough. Breakthrough is her organization.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
We had a very interesting conversation because many of us felt the same way about issues. We just used variations of words, but it really came down to the same thing. And I always find that very fascinating, and I'd like to add that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Savannah. Lloyd, you're unmuted.
You're muted, Lloyd.
Okay, yeah, you had us all muted so that I couldn't unmute.
Yeah.
Now it is unmuted, okay. Just wanted to share a couple of things. One, my spiritual practice is based upon Native American wisdom. And one thing I really appreciate there, they see 4 dimensions in which we live every aspect of our lives. And that's the mental, the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual. And Mallika talked about, and I think you too, Elizabeth or Thomas, about the common separation in activists between their spiritual and their activism.
Mm-hmm.
And with Native Americans, it's that each of those dimensions needs expression in everything that we do and needs to be balanced for there to be harmony in our actions. And one of the things I've really been looking at this year is emotions, which don't often get talked about in activism. And we have all been wounded as children and frequently have not dealt with that. And a lot of spiritual involvement is an attempt to bypass the wounding from the emotional pain that we still bear. And so I'm really looking at that as an aspect of changing the world, is how we relearn the vocabulary of emotions, because it seems to me that it's in our emotional connections that we are most quintessentially human. And another thing that I've been exploring this year is language, and not just the difference in words, but the structure of language itself.
Click the button.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, I'm just saying something to Thomas.
Okay.
We're trying to unmute you guys, and we're having a little trouble right now.
Okay. And there again, the huge difference between Native American and English. In English, it's a very noun-centered language. There are more nouns in English than any other language known in history. And that both reflects and reinforces our Newtonian cosmology, that the universe is comprised of all of these separate, distinct objects. And Native American languages tend to be very much about verbs. And they can go all day without using a noun. Now, I can't even conceptualize that, having grown up in English, but I've had some brief exposures to this. And the difference is that they see everything as process. So everything is about movement and about relationship. And it gives a very different way of dealing with things and how things look to them. And so there's never any consideration of control. They know that you cannot understand all the relationships that are involved in the processes. In a way, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is a statement of that understanding. And In English, focusing on nouns gives us the idea, the illusion that there's certainty to the physical world. And that feeds our impetus in the West to control, or to strive for the illusion of control. So the difference in the language is there. I think in English, it makes it very difficult for us to overcome the things that we've been talking about, because the language itself, just by its very structure, reinforces what is. So I'm complete. You're muted now.
Go ahead, Christine.
Okay.
Me, is it?
Okay, thank you. Okay, now I'm unmuted. First of all, I really want to thank you for this year at all, what you do, Thomas and Elizabeth, because I think it's just great. Last year, I couldn't join the course, and I was really tempted to, and I'm glad that you do these open spaces. The one thing I wanted to respond to what you said, Lloyd, in terms of the Native American language and the English language, and then the German language, because I'm German. Well, the German language is even more on the nouns, I think, and more stuck. To me, the English language is more fluid and more on the verb, if you use it right anyway. And so I'm very curious to explore the Native American language. I think when there's a lot of wisdom, obviously, when they use the verbs, that there's a lot of flow and flow and flow, not so much stuckness. That's beautiful to hear. Yeah, actually, yeah, that's what I want to say.
I think, Eric, and you're definitely right that the German language is much more heavy on nouns than the English language.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Hey, Michael.
We're talking about languages since I'm studying 2 languages. Recently, we talked about deconstructivism, and since I'm studying some Buddhist teachings for a while, the idea was not so new to me, but I was so shocked to see, or surprised, maybe is the better word, to see how closely most people really are to these concepts. For them, if there's a word for it, the thing is real. So how, for some people, this thought is so present, but that this is not the case. But for most people, if you don't reflect about this, how deeply entrenched it's in our consciousness that if there's a word, if there's a concept, then that is really a thing, which is so untrue.
That's the power of language.
Yeah.
Isn't language unbelievable? I just say the word tree, in every one of our consciousness, a tree arises. That's a quite magical thing. So I think if you talk about global stories and finding new stories, I think an interesting way to think about is how do we tell these new stories so that they are life embracing. I think that's
and evoking.
Life embracing and evoking, good point, yes. And also how we can evolve our language so that we start languaging maybe with our language. So I think that's in fact also part of a form of activism, just to be aware that the way we construct reality through the words that we use is part of how we create this world. So all 3 of you, I very much agree with that. Yes, Tony.
You can just unmute yourself and join the conversation.
Yes, on the lower left button. But I can help you and unmute you from my side.
That's grand, thanks. No, just a very brief comment, because I don't want to be taking more than my share of the time. But going back to Lloyd's original comment, I have worked part-time as a translator in recent years, and I'm very interested in the structure of languages. And in Europe, the Irish language, the old Irish language, which was used in writing in the manuscripts, has the form, has the structure. It begins a sentence with the verb, followed by a subject, and the object comes at the end. So it's verb, subject, object.
Mm.
And I've done a Google search for how many languages in the world have that format. And it's only the old languages. I found no other language in Europe that has that structure. And only Polynesian islands have it, as far as I can make out. And the name of goodness, how Ireland linked up with Polynesia, it must have been at the time of the early continental shift. But no, the relevant point that comes from that is, if we put the verb at the beginning of the sentence, we're emphasizing the action. If we put the subject at the beginning of a sentence, we're drawing attention to who is doing it.
Right.
So I'll silence myself there. Thank you.
Yeah. But the good part of the news, as I understand you, is also that language is changing in the way we use it. So the way we change our language, maybe in 500 years, the English language will have a different face.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great comment about language evolving. I study and I teach spiral dynamics, and it sounds like the earlier languages, as was said, are ones that were pre-written, so they were more oral. And that as we evolved into more complexity, we evolved toward more separateness, in a sense. So in a sense, our complexity of thinking has helped us feel more separate. And I think that's reflected in the evolution of our language. So maybe as we recognize and we reach kind of a peak of our individuality, and we start to be more connected and feel more connected and use more connected language, that we will start to evolve our language back toward more, less about separate nouns and more about related verbs.
Carol, are you trying to speak? We don't hear you.
Okay, I've unmuted myself. I just wanted to add one aspect of the English language to the conversation on the basis of my teaching experience. And the key point here is process. There's an aspect of the English language which has sort of, I would say, gone into the background, and that's the Celtic heritage in the English language, in form, in all times. I am going, I was going, I have been going, I will be going, and so on. And it's interesting how this aspect of English is used differently, more or less in various cultures. As you go west, it's used less, but as you go east, it's used a lot more. For example, in India, you get to the point where people say, I am loving, and it's not just the fact, I love. And so obviously the English language does have potential with regard to this whole aspect of process, but it has been losing a lot of it through the very pragmatic development which it has undergone through the dominance of the language in the world today. I just wanted to add that because it's a very, I think it's a very special aspect of English.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting how we started a conversation about activism, and particularly with the specific example of violence, domestic violence and violence against women and girls, and we moved to narrative stories, and we're now talking about our language, which at this right now we share as English, but we're also multilingual here, and are all forced to speak English at this moment, which is a great thing, and also is a limitation. But I think that our coming together more and more is probably going to create more shifts that are going to be the foundation, probably the essence of which will be the foundation of new stories. And I wonder if we should wrap for tonight there. We've been in the forum for almost 2 hours. Yeah.
We'll send you the video as soon as we have it online.
We'll send you the video and the audio, and I will do a Facebook group. I promised this I think 2 months ago, that I will create a Facebook group, and then whoever wants to share their email address there, or it'll be a closed group, who wants to share their emails there, you can do that. I don't think that it doesn't seem right for us to get involved in sharing email addresses.
So you also have the right to not share your email address if you don't want to.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you
so
all.
much.
Thank you, Tom and Elizabeth. Bye.
Bye, all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Dankeschön.
Bye bye.
Bitteschön.